Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku took Joker's place as Gotham's wild card. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The world did not fade. It shattered. One moment, Izuku Midoriya was a maelstrom of green lightning and focused intent, his mind a razor-sharp calculation of percentages and trajectories. The villain before him was a nobody, a petty thief with a monstrously powerful and unstable quirk, the ability to unravel spacetime in a small, localized area. A warp gate quirk, but a flawed, volatile one. Deku had the man on the ropes, a final 8% Detroit smash already coiled in his muscles, ready to end the fight and get back to UA before Aizawa-sensei even noticed he'd broken curfew. He could see Ida's disapproving handchops, Uraraka's worried frown, Todoroki's quiet, supportive nod. The next moment, the thief, in a fit of panic desperation, overloaded his power. He didn't aim it. He just detonated it. Reality fractured like a dropped mirror. The grimy back alley of Mizurufu twisted into a kaleidoscope of impossible colors. The sounds of the city, the distant traffic, the hum of electricity, was shredded into a deafening shriek of static that vibrated in Deku's very bones. He felt a sensation like being pulled through a keyhole, his body stretched and compressed simultaneously. The vestiges of One for All inside him roared, not in power, but in a panicked, chaotic alarm. He felt their presences flicker like dying embers as the connection to his world was violently torn away. He reached out, a desperate, silent scream on his lips for a hand that wasn't there. All Might! Mom! Anyone! Then nothing. Only the violent, gut-wrenching tumble through an abyss of screaming, kaleidoscopic light. And then impact. Pain was the first herald of his return to consciousness. It was a symphony of agony. A sharp, searing fire in his left shoulder where he'd landed, a dull, throbbing drumbeat behind his eyes, and 1,000 smaller aches from scrapes and bruises that were already purpling beneath the torn fabric of his gamma costume. The world swam back into focus not as a whole, but in jagged, disjointed pieces. The ground was rough, gritty. It smelled foul. Not the familiar urban scent of exhaust and street food from home, but something deeper, more rotten. It was the smell of old rain on older garbage, of decay and rust, and something vaguely metallic, like stale blood. It clung to the back of his throat, a taste as much as a scent. He pushed himself up with a groan, his vision doubling for a dizzying second before settling. He was in an alley. No, not an alley. A canyon. Soot-stained brick walls soared into a sky he couldn't see, choked by a lattice of rusting fire escapes that looked like the skeletal ribs of some long-dead leviathan. The air was heavy, thick with a damp chill that seeped through the rips in his suit and raised goosebumps on his skin. A constant, mournful dripping sound echoed from somewhere nearby, a lonely metronome counting out the seconds in this miserable place. What? He rasped, his own voice sounding alien and thin. He coughed, the foul air scratching his lungs. What happened? The villain, he checked himself over. His costume was a wreck. The armored plating on his shoulder was cracked, the fabric torn at the knee and elbow. His mask was gone, likely ripped away in the transit. One of his iron saws was sparking intermittently, a sad, pathetic fizzle of green light. He fumbled for his utility belt. The pouches were mostly intact, but when he tried the comms unit in his ear, all he got was a wall of impenetrable static. Uraraka-san? Ida-kun? Can anyone hear me? He tried again, his voice rising with a tremor of panic. Todoroki-kun? Aizawa-sensei? All Might? Only the static answered, hissing like a nest of snakes in his ear. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This wasn't right. Even if a communications tower was down, he should be able to get something. A local police frequency, a radio broadcast, anything. But there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence of the alley and the mocking hiss of his dead comms. He staggered to his feet, leaning against the cold, damp brick for support. His head swam. He needed to analyze. A hero stays calm, assesses the situation, and formulates a plan. Sir Night-Eye had drilled that into him. Think, Izuku, think. Okay. Fact 1. The villain's quirk backfired. Fact 2. he was transported. Fact 3. He was injured, but functional. Fact 4. He was alone and his communications were down. The logical next step was to find out where he was. He limped towards the mouth of the alley, his every step in agony. The world outside the narrow brick passage was a cacophony of new, jarring sounds. The sirens were different, a deeper, more guttural wail than the ones in Japan. The sound of car horns was more aggressive, more frequent, and underneath it all was a low, constant thrum of human misery, shouting, arguing, the distant shatter of glass. He peered out from the alley's edge, and his breath hitched. The street was slick with a recent rain, reflecting the lurid neon signs of rundown bars and pawn shops. The signs weren't in Japanese, they were in English. Liquor, pawn shop we buy gold, Gotham City Tribune, Gotham City. The name meant nothing to him. It wasn't a city in Japan. It wasn't a city he'd ever heard of in his geography lessons. The architecture was all wrong, a grotesque fusion of ornate, Gothic spires and brutalist concrete monstrosities, all seemingly decaying under the weight of their own grime. Above, the sky was a bruised, starless purple, the clouds so thick they seemed to be a solid ceiling, trapping the city in its own gloom. A wave of vertigo washed over him. This wasn't just a different city. This was somewhere else entirely. The realization didn't land like a feather, it hit like a freight train. He was lost on a scale he couldn't comprehend. The sheer, crushing weight of his isolation threatened to buckle his knees. His mom. His friends. All might. Were they looking for him? Did they even know what happened? Was he in a different country? A different world? His spiraling thoughts were cut short by a sound that was, tragically, universal. A woman's frightened gasp, followed by a man's low, menacing growl. It was happening just across the street, in the mouth of another, even darker alley. A man, gaunt and shivering in a threadbare coat, had a woman pressed against the wall. He was thin, but wiry, and a desperate, feral energy radiated from him. In his hand, a grimy switchblade caught the faint neon light, its edge pressed against the woman's throat. She was clutching a worn purse to her chest, her eyes wide with terror. The logical part of Deku's brain, the part that was screaming about his injuries and his unknown location, shouted at him. Stop. Observe. You don't know the rules here. You don't know the language, you could make things worse. But the core of him, the foundational pillar of his very being that had made him rush the sludge villain with nothing but a school bag, was already moving. It wasn't a decision. It was a reflex. Someone was in trouble. He had to help. He didn't have time for a grand entrance. He didn't have time to think. He just pushed off the ground, a flicker of green energy from One for All, full cowling enveloping him. He kept it low, just 5%. Enough to be fast, but not enough to shatter the pavement or draw widespread attention. To the terrified woman and her assailant, it was as if a ghost had materialized. 1 second, there was an empty street, the next, a figure in a bizarre, torn green costume was standing between them. The air crackled with a faint hum, and faint, spider-webbing lines of emerald light danced across the newcomer's body. The mugger froze, his eyes widening. His brain couldn't process what it was seeing. This kid, he couldn't be more than a teenager, was dressed like some kind of cartoon character, with big white eyes on a strange headpiece and a respirator-like mask. He was battered and bruised, but he stood with a solidity that was completely at odds with his youthful appearance. What the hell are you? The mugger snarled in English, a language Deku didn't understand. But the tone, aggression, fear, confusion, was clear enough. Deku held up his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. His mind was racing, trying to apply heroic protocol to this utterly alien situation. De-escalate. Protect the civilian. Neutralize the threat non-lethally. He spoke in Japanese, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Daijoubu desu ka? He asked, his gaze fixed on the woman. Are you okay? Then he turned his attention to the mugger, his expression softening into one of genuine concern. Please put the knife down. No one needs to get hurt. The mugger just stared, his knuckles white on the hilt of his knife. This costumed freak was babbling at him in some foreign tongue. The sounds were soft, melodic, completely out of place in the grimy violence of the moment. The woman used the distraction to shove the man away and scramble backward, crab walking into the street. The mugger, his target now gone, refocused his fear and rage on the bizarre interloper. He lunged, swiping wildly with the knife. "Get away from me, freak!" Deku didn't even flinch. His body, honed by countless hours of training, moved with an economy of motion that seemed supernatural. He sidestepped the clumsy slash, the blade whistling past his ear. He saw the opening, the man's entire right side exposed. A flick of his finger, a 5% Delaware smash, would have sent a cannonball of air pressure to disarm him from a distance. A simple chop to the neck would have ended it instantly. But then he looked at the man's face. He saw the sunken cheeks, the desperation in his eyes, the track marks on his arm. This wasn't a supervillain. This was a man at the absolute end of his rope. A man who needed help, not a beating. So Deku chose a different path. He pivoted on his heel, his legs sweeping out. He didn't aim for the man's head or chest. He aimed for his hand. A 5% shoot-style kick, precise and controlled, connected with the mugger's wrist. It wasn't a bone-shattering blow, just a sharp, painful impact. Crack. The sound was small, but decisive. The knife flew from the man's numb fingers, clattering against the far wall of the alley. The mugger cried out, clutching his wrist, his face a mask of shock and pain. He stumbled back, his eyes darting between his now useless hand and the glowing green boy in front of him. Deku stepped forward, his hands still raised placatingly. The green lightning of full cowling subsided, leaving him standing there in his torn suit. He looked at the man, his heart aching with a familiar pang of empathy. "Gomen nasai," he said softly, his voice full of genuine regret. "I'm sorry. I didn't want to hurt you. But you were scaring her." He took another step closer. The mugger flinched, trying to press himself into the brick wall. This was the part that broke the situation. This was the moment that planted the first seed of a terrifying new legend in the Gotham underworld. Deku didn't loom over him. He didn't deliver a self-righteous speech or a final, brutal punch. Instead, his posture softened. The faint light from the street illuminated his face, and the mugger saw something that made his blood run cold. The kid's eyes were glistening with unshed tears. "Nays?" Deku asked, his voice cracking with emotion. "Why? Why are you doing this? Are you hungry? Are you in trouble? There has to be a better way." The mugger, a man named Johnny who had seen mob hits, turf wars, and the bat himself, had never in his life felt a fear like this. The bat was terrifying because he was a creature of shadow and pain. He was logical, predictable in his brutality. This thing was the opposite. It was a creature of blinding light and bizarre, unnerving gentleness. It had broken his wrist with casual, impossible speed, and now it was crying for him. It was the most insane, unsettling thing he had ever witnessed. "Tsukuri yo," Deku whispered, reaching a hand into one of his utility pouches. "I can help you." Johnny flinched, expecting a weapon, a taser, something. Instead, the kid pulled out a small, worn wallet. He fumbled through it, his expression pained, as if he was about to perform a surgery on himself. He pulled out a few crumpled bills, Japanese yen, utterly worthless here, but Johnny didn't know that. Deku pushed them into Johnny's good hand. "It's not much," Deku said, his Japanese words a meaningless, soft melody to the mugger's ears. "But please, use it to buy some food. Don't do this again. If you need help, you have to ask for it." Johnny stared at the foreign money in his hand, then back at the teary-eyed, earnest face of the green creature before him. His mind simply couldn't compute the sequence of events. He had tried to rob a woman. He was stopped by a glowing, gibberish-speaking monster who broke his wrist, then cried for him, then paid him? The logic of Crime Alley, the simple predator-prey dynamic that had governed his entire life, shattered. He did the only thing he could. He turned and ran, cradling his broken wrist, not even looking back. Deku watched him go, a profound sadness settling over him. He had stopped the crime, yes. But he hadn't solved the problem. He had just put a tiny, temporary bandage on a deep, festering wound. A small whimper drew his attention. The woman was still there, huddled by a rusted-out dumpster, staring at him with the same terror the mugger had shown. She saw the same thing, a freak, a powerful, unpredictable being that operated on a logic completely alien to Gotham. Deku's hero training kicked in again. Secure the civilian. Make sure they're safe. He took a slow step towards her, his expression as gentle as he could make it. He switched to the little English he knew from school, the words clumsy and heavily accented. Okay? You okay? He asked, pointing at her. The woman didn't answer. She just scrambled to her feet, clutching her purse like a shield. Stay back! She shrieked, her voice shrill with panic. Get away from me! You're a monster! A freak! She turned and fled down the street, her footsteps echoing in the oppressive quiet, leaving Deku standing alone in the middle of the grimy road. Freak. The word, even in a language he barely understood, struck him like a physical blow. He had saved her. He had done the right thing. And she had looked at him with pure, unadulterated fear. In Japan, people would have been cheering. Reporters would have been swarming. Other heroes would be arriving to help secure the scene. Here, there was nothing. Just the dripping water, the distant, mournful sirens, and the crushing, absolute silence of his own isolation. He was a hero with no one to save who wanted to be saved by him. He was a boy a universe away from home. The adrenaline finally ebbed away, and the full weight of his situation came crashing down. The pain in his shoulder flared, white-hot. His head pounded. A deep, soul-shaking exhaustion settled into his bones. He needed to get off the street. He needed a high place, a vantage point to try and make sense of this sprawling, hostile city. Using the last of his energy, he channeled one for all into his legs and leaped. He soared through the air, the wind cold against his face, landing with a soft thud on the rooftop of a 5-story tenement building. The landing sent a jolt of agony up his leg, and he collapsed onto the tar-papered roof, breathing heavily. From here, the city of Gotham revealed itself in its full, horrifying glory. It was a jagged scar on the face of the world, a forest of stone and steel teeth gnashing at the perpetually dark sky. Far in the distance, a colossal, Gothic tower bearing the name Wayne scraped the bottom of the clouds, a monument of wealth in a sea of decay. Closer, gargoyles perched on the edges of buildings like stone vultures, their empty eyes watching over the city with silent malice. There were no bright lights like in downtown Nizurifu, only the sickly yellow glow of streetlights and the desperate neon of vice. He was well and truly lost. He sat there for what felt like hours, the cold of the roof seeping into him, making him shiver. He pulled off his tattered glove and looked at his own scarred hand, the hand that held the power of 8 heroes before him. The hand that was meant to be the next symbol of peace. What good was it here? What good was a symbol of peace in a place that seemed to have never known it? The dam of his composure finally broke. A single, hot tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. Then another. Soon, silent sobs were shaking his entire body. He cried for his mother, imagining her worry. He cried for his friends, for the futures they were supposed to build together. He cried for All Might, for the immense burden he felt he was failing to carry. He cried for himself, a scared, lonely teenager in a cold, dark, and utterly alien world. His tears eventually subsided, leaving him hollowed out and shivering. The despair was a physical thing, a cold weight in his stomach threatening to pull him down into the darkness. It would be so easy to give up. To just lie here until he was found, or until he wasn't. But then, a memory surfaced. All Might, his great, beaming smile shining even in his skeletal form, telling him, "A smiling, dependable, cool hero. That's what I want to be." The smile. It wasn't just for the cameras. It wasn't just for show. It was a weapon. A shield against despair. It was a promise to the people who were scared that everything was going to be okay. It was a declaration to the villains that they had already lost. Most importantly, it was a tool for the hero himself, a way to trick his own fear, to hold back the tears and stand tall against impossible odds. Izuku Midoriya took a ragged, shuddering breath. He looked out over the hopeless, sprawling city of Gotham. A city drowning in despair, a city that had looked at his heroism and called him a freak. It needed a hero more than any place he had ever seen. He didn't know how he would get home. He didn't know how he would survive the night. He didn't have a plan. All he had was the power in his veins and the unshakable, often foolish, creed that had been beaten into his very soul. A hero saves people. He pushed himself to his feet, his aching body protesting every movement. He looked out at the concrete jungle that was his new prison, his new battlefield, his new responsibility. And he did the hardest thing he had ever done in his life. He smiled. It wasn't All Might's booming, confident grin. It was a small, fragile thing, trembling at the corners. It was streaked with tears and shadowed by pain and loneliness. It was a smile born of pure, desperate defiance against the overwhelming darkness. In the context of the grim, cynical city of Gotham, it was the most terrifying, insane, and unpredictable expression it had ever seen. It was the smile of a new kind of chaos. The smile of the wild card. And as another siren began to wail in the distance, Izuku Midoriya took his first real step into his new life, his broken smile a silent promise to the city below. He would save them. All of them. Whether they wanted him to or not. 6 weeks. 42 days. 1,008 hours. Izuku Midoriya had counted every single one. Each rotation of this unfamiliar planet was a new verse in a song of isolation. Survival had become a brutal, all-consuming routine. He had found a semi-permanent shelter in a forgotten maintenance tunnel beneath the Gotham subway system, a place so deep and disused that even the rats seemed to have given up on it. It was damp, smelled of ozone and century-old mildew, but it was defensible and hidden. It was home. His life was a study in adaptation. He learned to navigate the city not by its streets, but by its rooftops and forgotten alleyways. He learned which dumpsters behind which restaurants offered the best, albeit least appealing, meals. He learned that the only currency more valuable than cash in the Narrows was silence, and the ability to be invisible. His analytical mind, once dedicated to hero analysis, was now a finely tuned survival engine. He charted patrol routes of the grimly efficient Gotham City Police Department. He mapped the territories of the city's various gangs, noting their colors, their habits, their predators and prey. He learned the rhythm of the city's heartbeat, a frantic, arrhythmic tattoo of fear and desperation. Most importantly, he learned to fight the despair that was Gotham's most potent toxin. Every morning, as the weak, gray light struggled to pierce the perpetual smog, he would run through his UA, training katas in the echoing darkness of the tunnel. He would whisper the names of his friends, his teachers, his mother, like a prayer, a desperate mantra to keep their faces from fading from his memory. He held on to one unshakable belief: they were looking for him. They wouldn't give up. And until they found him, or he found a way back, he had a job to do. He was still a hero. Even if no one here knew it. His first forays into heroism had been messy. He'd stop a purse snatching and the victim would scream at the sight of him. He'd disarm a would-be carjacker and the driver would speed away, tires squealing in terror. They saw the flash of green light, the impossible speed, the torn bizarre costume, and their Gotham-forged instincts screamed one word: freak. But slowly, in the city's deepest, most forgotten corners, a different story was being told. The whispers started in dive bars and homeless shelters, passed between low-level thugs and the dregs of society. They spoke of a new player, something that wasn't Bat, wasn't Cop, and wasn't one of the crazies from Arkham. They called him Smiley, or sometimes the Grin. The name came from a 2-bit enforcer named Leo, who'd been shaking down a soup kitchen for protection money. A green blur had intervened. Leo expected pain, a broken arm, the usual calling card of a vigilante marking his territory. He got that, a precise, dislocating pressure to his shoulder, but it came with something else. As the blur resolved into the shape of a kid, Leo saw his face. He was smiling. A bright, wide, almost painful-looking smile that didn't reach his eyes. Because his eyes, impossibly, were filled with tears. It looked at me like it was sorry for me, Leo would later stammer to his boss, his voice shaking. Like it was the saddest thing in the world that it had to hurt me. Who does that? What does that? The legend of the Grin was one of contradictions. He was impossibly strong but never killed. He was terrifyingly fast but would spend an hour helping an old woman fix the wheel on her shopping cart. He took down criminals not with brutal finality, but with a strange, sorrowful efficiency, often leaving them more confused and psychologically shaken than physically harmed. He was an anomaly, a ghost who wept for the city's sins while wearing a bizarre, unwavering smile. Tonight that ghost was perched on a skeletal crane overlooking the Gotham docks. The air here was thick with the smell of brine, diesel, and rotting fish. Below, the inky black water of the Gotham River slapped listlessly against the barnacle-encrusted pylons of Pier 12. It was territory belonging to Oswald Cobblepot, the Penguin, a fact made obvious by the handful of goons in long coats milling about, their breath pluming in the damp, cold air. They were waiting. Deku had been watching this pier for 3 nights. His danger sense, a faint, persistent buzzing at the back of his skull that had become a constant companion in this city, had been screaming at him about this place. He'd observed the pattern, the quiet nights, the single truck arriving just after 2 a.m., the heavily armed men. Tonight was the night. A pair of headlights cut through the gloom, and a large, unmarked shipping truck rumbled to a stop at the end of the pier. The back rolled up, revealing crates stamped with the logo of a Serbian arms manufacturer. Military grade. Far beyond the usual handguns and shotguns that flowed through Gotham's veins, these were weapons for a small war. Deku's smile tightened. His stomach churned with a cold, familiar anger. Tools designed for one purpose: to hurt, to maim, to kill, to create more orphans, more widows, more pain in a city that was already drowning in it. He watched as Penguin's men began to unload the crates. There were 6 of them. One, a large, bull-necked man who was clearly the leader, directed the others with grunts and curses. 4 were muscle, carrying automatic rifles with a casual familiarity. The last was the driver, who stayed by the cab, nervously smoking a cigarette. Analysis complete. Objective: neutralize the threat, secure the weapons. Constraints: minimal injury, no fatalities. Method: overwhelming speed and precision. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. He closed his eyes, picturing All Might's face. For them. So they don't have to be afraid anymore. He activated One for All full cowling. 8%. Green lightning, silent and hungry, erupted around his body. From his perch on the crane, he became a living comet. He didn't drop. He launched. He crossed the 50 yards from the crane to the pier in less than a second, landing on the roof of the truck's cab with a sound no louder than a cat's footfall. The driver, exhaling a plume of smoke, felt a faint vibration. He glanced up at his side mirror, frowning. For a split second, he saw a reflection of 2 glowing green eyes. He blinked, and they were gone. Before he could even process the image, his door was ripped from its hinges with a screech of tortured metal. A hand, encased in a green glove, shot out and gently plucked the cigarette from his lips, crushing it. Another hand chopped him precisely at the base of the neck. His eyes rolled back, and he slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious before he even knew he was attacked. 1 down. The thugs below were halfway through unloading the first crate when the lights on the pier flickered and died. A single, well-aimed kick from Deku had shattered the junction box. The dock was plunged into near-total darkness, relieved only by the distant, hazy glow of the city. "What the hell?" the leader growled. "Sparks, get the lights back on!" "On it, boss!" One of the thugs broke off, jogging towards the junction box with a flashlight. He didn't make it 5 feet. A green blur shot past him. He felt a sharp, stinging impact on his rifle, as if it had been struck by lightning. He looked down. The barrel was bent into a perfect U-shape, completely useless. He looked up, bewildered, just in time to see a length of thick, greasy shipping cable, plucked from a nearby spool, wrap around his ankles and hoist him upside down, dangling from a lamppost. 2 down. Panic began to set in. The remaining 3 thugs raised their rifles, wildly pointing them into the oppressive darkness. "Who's there? Show yourself, it's the Bat! He found us!" The leader, a man named Tiny, scoffed. "The Bat don't play games like this. This is something else. Form up! Back to back!" They huddled together, a tiny island of terrified aggression in the dark. They were right. The Bat was a creature of fear and shadow, but his methods were known. He was a scalpel. This felt like a hurricane. A flicker of green lightning appeared 20 feet in front of them. It was him. The grin? He was just standing there, his head tilted slightly, the faint green energy illuminating the impossible smile on his face. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, there was silence. Only the sound of the lapping water and the frantic pounding of their own hearts. Then, Tiny roared and opened fire. The muzzle flash was blinding, the sound a deafening roar that echoed across the water. He emptied half a clip into the spot where the creature had been. When the spots faded from his vision, the figure was gone. "Where'd he go? Where'd he?" A voice whispered from directly behind him, spoken in a language he didn't recognize but in a tone that was impossibly gentle. "Daijobu." Tiny spun around, firing wildly. He hit nothing but air. The other two thugs panicked, spraying bullets into the darkness. Their shots pinged off shipping containers and splashed into the water. In their terror, they didn't realize they were being systematically disarmed. A shoot-style kick, faster than the eye could follow, shattered the stock of one rifle. A Delaware smash, a flick of a finger releasing a targeted cannonball of air, ripped the second rifle from the last thug's hands and sent it spinning into the river. In the span of 5 seconds they were weaponless. They stared at their empty hands in disbelief, the silence now more terrifying than the gunfire had been. Deku reappeared before them, the green lightning of full cowling dancing around him. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if walking through water. He was holding the length of shipping cable. It danced in his hands like a living thing, a steel serpent. It was a technique he'd seen Ciro use 1,000 times, a fluid, binding style he had meticulously copied into his notebooks. He darted forward, a whirlwind of motion. The cable was a blur, looping around wrists, ankles, and torsos. He moved between the three men, weaving an intricate, inescapable web. It was over in moments. They were trussed up together, back to back, bound so tightly they could barely breathe. 4, 5, and 6. All down. Non-lethal. Efficient. Deku stood before them, the green glow fading. The leader, Tiny, craned his neck to look up at him. The kid's mask was gone, lost weeks ago, and in the faint moonlight filtering through the clouds, Tiny could see his face clearly. He was just a boy, with a spray of freckles and a shock of unruly green hair, and he was smiling that same, awful smile Leo had described. A smile that looked like it was trying to hold back a flood. "Why?" Tiny growled, struggling against the unbreakable bonds. "What do you want? The guns? The money? You want a piece of Cobblepot's action?" Deku's smile faltered for a second. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the sentiment. Greed. Power. Territory. The base motivations of this city's darkness. He shook his head, a gesture that was universally understood. He knelt down, his expression turning sorrowful. He pointed at the thugs, then at the crates of weapons. He spoke in his soft, foreign tongue, his voice filled with a heartbreaking sincerity. "Kore de nani o surutsumori datano?" he asked. "What were you going to do with these? Kana mano de, derika jie kanashimadeta." Things like this only make people sad. Tiny stared, mesmerized and horrified. The kid reached out and gently brushed a smudge of dirt from his cheek. The touch was so startlingly gentle, so completely alien to the violence of the moment, that Tiny flinched as if he'd been burned. The kid's eyes were glistening again. He was crying. Crying for them. The sheer, unadulterated insanity of it was more terrifying than any threat the Joker could ever make. This wasn't a play for power. This was something else entirely. Something broken. Something new. Deku stood up. He left the men tied securely for the GCPD. They weren't his primary concern. The weapons were. He walked over to the largest crate, the one filled with assault rifles. With a grunt of effort, he hefted the entire thing onto his shoulder. It weighed several 100 pounds, but he carried it as if it were a bag of groceries. He gave one last, sorrowful look at the bound criminals, then turned and vanished into the shadows of the container yard. An hour later, in the hellish glow of an abandoned steel foundry on the industrial outskirts of the city, Deku performed his ritual. The foundry was a cavernous, rust-red cathedral of forgotten industry. A massive, blast-shielded furnace stood in the center like a malevolent altar. It had taken him a week to get it working again, using his strength to manually operate the broken bellows and his knowledge of mechanics to patch the gas lines. He opened the crate. The rifles lay nestled in foam, sleek and black and cold. They were objects of terrible beauty, perfectly engineered killing machines. He looked at them not with hatred, but with a profound pity. They were like a virus, an idea given physical form, with no purpose but to spread suffering. One by one, he took them out and fed them into the roaring mouth of the furnace. He didn't just toss them in. He placed each one on the crucible with a strange reverence, as if performing last rites. He watched as the heat warped the metal, the stocks burning away, the steel barrels glowing cherry red, then white hot, before finally succumbing and melting into a formless, incandescent slag. He worked methodically, his face illuminated by the fire, sweat beading on his brow. His smile was gone now, replaced by an expression of intense, focused solemnity. This wasn't a victory. It was a cleanup. It was sanitation. It was removing a poison from the city's water supply. Weapons shouldn't exist, he whispered to the roaring flames, his voice hoarse. If they're only used to hurt people, they just shouldn't exist. It was a simple, childlike sentiment. A profoundly naive and hopelessly idealistic belief. In a city built on the power of the gun, on the threat of violence, it was the most radical, chaotic, and dangerous idea of all. When the last rifle was gone, he sealed the furnace. The poison was contained, for tonight at least. The screech of the Batmobile's tires was the only sound that dared to challenge the authority of the wailing sirens. Batman emerged from the cockpit like a wraith, his cape billowing behind him. Commissioner James Gordon was already on the scene, standing over the huddled, shivering group of Penguin's men, a look of weary exasperation on his face. "Tell me again, Tiny," Gordon said, taking a long drag from his cigarette. "And try to make it sound slightly less like you've been sniffing paint thinner." Tiny, now shivering under a police-issue blanket, looked up with wild eyes as Batman approached. "It was him, Commissioner. The grin. He came out of nowhere, a green light, he was so fast." Batman loomed over him, his presence sucking the very air from the space around him. "Report," he growled, his voice a low rumble of gravel and menace. He took the lights out. Just popped them. Then he was on us. We fired, we emptied everything we had. But it was like shooting at smoke. He bent my rifle, tied us up with this damn cable." Tiny gestured with his head to the thick shipping rope that still lay coiled on the ground, cut away by the police. "He was inhuman," Gordon sighed, smoke curling from his nostrils. "And the weapons shipment? 12 crates of military-grade hardware? Gone," Tiny whispered, his voice cracking. "He took M. Just lifted a whole damn crate and walked off into the night." Batman's eyes narrowed behind his cowl. A new player muscling in on Penguin's arms trade? It was a bold move. But the story didn't add up. He worked alone? Yeah. I think so. And he said nothing? Tiny swallowed hard, the memory making his skin crawl. He was babbling. Some weird language, but his face. Jim, I'm telling you, the way he looked at us. He trailed off, unable to articulate the sheer wrongness of it. "Spit it out," Batman commanded. "He was smiling," Tiny said, his voice barely a whisper. "But he was crying. Like he felt sorry for us while he was breaking us. It wasn't a Joker smile. It wasn't crazy. It was sad. It was the scariest damn thing I've ever seen." Gordon and Batman exchanged a look. This matched the other scattered reports. The bizarre, contradictory behavior. The non-lethal, yet overwhelming force. "He didn't take the other crates," Gordon noted, pointing his flashlight at the rest of the shipment, still sitting in the truck. "If he was after the guns to sell them, why leave the rest? And why this one?" Batman walked over to the truck, his cape sweeping across the damp asphalt. He ran a gloved finger along the edge of an empty weapon rack inside the open crate. His cowl's advanced sensors began a microscopic scan of the area. "He wasn't after them to sell," Batman stated, his voice flat. He had already reached a conclusion. This wasn't a business transaction. It was a statement. But what was it trying to say? A small light blinked in his heads-up display. Anomalous energy signature detected. He focused the scanner. Faint, residual particles clung to the air where the grin had been most active. The energy was biological in origin, but it didn't match any known metahuman profile in his extensive database. It wasn't from the Speed Force. It wasn't magical. It wasn't related to a mother box. It was something completely, terrifyingly new. "Gordon," Batman said, turning away from the truck. "This individual is now my top priority. Higher than Cobblepot. Higher than Two-Face." Gordon raised an eyebrow. "He took out a few of Penguin's goons without killing them and stole some guns. Annoying, sure. But top priority, he's an unknown," Batman countered, his voice dangerously low. "He possesses a power source I can't identify, and he operates on a logic I can't decipher. He dismantled an armed crew with surgical precision, yet he's described as an emotional wreck. He removes weapons from the street not to use or sell, but to, what? Hoard? Destroy?" He looked out at the dark, polluted water. "Gotham is a complex equation of fear, greed, and order. I know the variables. The Joker is chaos, Riddler is intellect, Penguin is ambition. I know how they think, I can predict them. This grin, he's not on the board. He's an unknown variable. And an unknown variable can make the whole equation collapse." Batman's mind was already working, connecting the dots from the past 6 weeks. Dozens of minor incidents, all bearing the same signature of strange, empathetic violence. He had dismissed them as unrelated, the work of a new, unstable vigilante. Now he saw the pattern. A force was moving through his city, not trying to conquer it or burn it down, but trying to heal it. The methods were chaotic, the ideology dangerously naive. In a city that ran on fear, a creature that weaponized hope and sorrow was the most unpredictable threat of all. "I'll find him," Batman vowed, more to himself than to Gordon. "And I'll find out what he is." He turned and strode back to the Batmobile, a black shadow against the city's grime. He was the guardian of a fragile, brutal order, and something had just arrived in his city that threatened to break that order in a way he had never conceived of, not with a bang or a joke, but with a tear-filled, heartbreaking smile. The hunt was on. The Batcave was a sanctuary of cold, hard logic. It was a place where chaos was dissected, where fear was analyzed, and where madness was categorized into neat, predictable files. It was Bruce Wayne's fortress against the irrationality of his city, a subterranean cathedral of steel, stone, and bleeding-edge technology. And tonight, its hallowed quiet was disturbed by a single, looping enigma. On the central monitor of the Bat computer, a fractal of emerald green energy pulsed softly. It was the anomalous signature from the docks, isolated and magnified 1,000,000 times. It was beautiful, organic, and utterly alien. For 3 days Bruce had thrown every analytical algorithm he possessed at it. The results were always the same, inconclusive. It was a biological power source of immense potential, with no known terrestrial or extraterrestrial match. It behaved like a living thing, a coiled spring of kinetic energy that defied the known laws of metahuman biology. "Any progress, Master Bruce?" The voice, dry as a vintage sherry and laced with a familiar, gentle disapproval, belonged to Alfred Pennyworth. He approached with a silver tray bearing a steaming mug of tea, his footsteps echoing softly in the cavernous space. Bruce didn't turn from the screen. His gloved fingers flew across a holographic keyboard, cross-referencing the energy signature with obscure occult texts and classified government projects. "He's not a magician. Not a rogue experiment from Cadmus. Not Atlantean, not Thanagarian. He's a ghost. A zero in a world of ones. Perhaps the zero is simply a number you have yet to learn to count," Alfred remarked, placing the mug on a coaster beside the console. "The reports from the street are varied, to say the least." He was being diplomatic. For the past 72 hours, Batman had waged a war of information, squeezing his network of informants until it bled rumors of the grin. The stories were a confusing tapestry of terror and wonder. One informant spoke of how the Green Blur had dismantled a Falcon drug operation, then spent 10 minutes meticulously restacking the crates of vegetables the thugs had knocked over. Another, a shivering pickpocket, described being caught by the entity, only to be given a stern but tearful lecture on self-worth and a handful of strange, foreign money. To Batman, these were not acts of heroism. They were calculated moves in a psychological campaign he didn't yet understand. He saw the pattern. The grin was systematically dismantling the established criminal hierarchy in Gotham's poorest sectors. Crime Alley, the Bowery, the East End. He was creating a power vacuum. In Gotham, a vacuum was never left unfilled. He was clearing the board to make himself the new king. The empathetic act, the bizarre crying, it was all part of the manipulation, a way to build a cult of personality among the city's downtrodden, to create a loyal army. It was a more insidious kind of power play than even the Joker had ever attempted. "He is establishing a territory, Alfred," Bruce stated, his voice a low growl. "These acts of kindness are a recruitment tool. He's building a foundation of public support so that when he makes his move, the people will see him as a savior, not a conqueror." Alfred adjusted his spectacles, his gaze lingering on the pulsating green light on the screen. "Or, and forgive the radical notion, sir, he may simply be a young man who is trying to help. No one is that pure," Batman retorted, the words sharp and cold as a batarang. "Not in this city. Purity is a vulnerability. It's a weakness to be exploited. He's using it as a weapon." His decision was made. Observation was no longer sufficient. He had to force a confrontation. He had to get a measure of this new player, test his strength, break through the facade of his strange, smiling altruism, and expose the ambition lurking beneath. He had the bait. His surveillance had identified a loan shark named Silas, the Thumb, Maroni, a low-level parasite who preyed on the desperate in a neighborhood the Grin had been particularly active in. Tonight, Maroni was scheduled to make a collection from a single mother of two. The location was a tenement building with a wide, flat roof, surrounded by taller structures, a perfect arena for Batman to control the engagement. He would allow the crime to begin, to draw his target in. Then, the trap would be sprung. Izuku Midoriya shivered, pulling the tattered remains of a wool blanket tighter around his shoulders. He was perched on the head of a stone gargoyle, a vantage point that gave him a clear view of 3 city blocks. The rain had started again, a miserable, persistent drizzle that plastered his green hair to his forehead and made the city's neon lights bleed into shimmering puddles on the street below. He was so tired. Not just physically, but a deep, soul-crushing weariness. Every act of heroism here felt like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. He'd stop a mugging, and 2 more would happen a block away. He'd dismantle an arms deal, and he knew another ship was already on its way. The city's misery was a hydra, and for every head he severed, 2 more seemed to grow in its place. His thoughts drifted, as they always did in these quiet moments, to home. He could almost smell his mother's katsudan. He could almost hear Uraraka's cheerful laugh, Ida's boisterous chopping motions, Todoroki's quiet, insightful observations. The memories were a source of both immense comfort and agonizing pain. They were the fuel that kept him going and the fire that was slowly burning him from the inside out. A faint, familiar buzzing started at the base of his skull. Danger sense. It wasn't the sharp, immediate alarm of an incoming attack. It was a low, persistent thrum. The kind that signaled a bad situation brewing, a tragedy in the making. He scanned the streets below, his eyes, now accustomed to Gotham's gloom, picking out details the average person would miss. There. An apartment building across the street, 3rd floor. The lights were on. Through the window, he could see a silhouette of a large, brutish man menacing 2 smaller figures, a woman and a child. The man's posture was aggressive, his hands gesturing wildly. Izuku didn't need to hear the words to understand the language of intimidation. His weariness evaporated, replaced by the cold, sharp focus of a hero. He pushed himself off the gargoyle, activating full cowling at a low 6%. He was a silent green streak, leaping across the alley, his iron saws barely making a sound as they connected with the opposite rooftop. He landed in a crouch, his eyes fixed on the apartment window. He was about to descend when the buzzing in his head suddenly spiked, screaming a new warning. It wasn't coming from the apartment. It was coming from above. From all around him. The rain seemed to coalesce into a single point of absolute darkness behind him. A shadow detached itself from the other shadows. Izuku's body reacted before his mind could, his training with Aizawa-sensei kicking in. He spun, dropping into a defensive stance, his arms raised. There, standing not 10 feet away, was the source of 1,000 terrified whispers on the streets. The Bat of Gotham. He was larger than the rumors suggested, a monolith of black and gray Kevlar. The cape, impossibly long, seemed to drink the very light from the air. The cowl was a masterwork of psychological terror, its pointed ears giving him a demonic silhouette, its white, unblinking lenses devoid of any emotion. He was perfectly still, a predator that had just revealed itself to its prey. For a moment neither moved. It was a standoff between two urban legends. Batman's voice, when it came, was not a shout. It was a low, mechanical growl that seemed to vibrate in the air itself. "You've been busy." Izuku's heart hammered in his chest. So this was the Batman he'd heard about. A vigilante like him. But where Izuku's presence was a flash of frantic light, this man was a void. He was the city's darkness given form. Izuku's limited English vocabulary struggled to form a response. "I help people," he managed, the words feeling small and inadequate. "You're disrupting the order of this city," Batman countered, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. His movements were fluid, economical, each one broadcasting a silent threat. "You're creating a vacuum. Tell me who you work for." "Work for?" Izuku was confused. The accusation didn't make sense. "I work for no one. I am hero." The word hung in the air between them. To Batman, it was the height of arrogance. To Izuku, it was the simplest statement of fact. "There are no heroes in Gotham." Batman growled, and then he moved. He didn't charge. He vanished. A smoke pellet, thrown with practiced precision, hit the rooftop between them, erupting in a thick, choking cloud. Izuku's eyes widened. He couldn't see, but his other senses screamed. Danger sense blared like a fire alarm in his skull, left high. He ducked just as a batarang sliced through the air where his head had been, embedding itself in a brick chimney with a solid thunk. Another warning, right low. He leaped back, and a second batarang, this one trailing a cable, snaked around his ankle. Batman was already reeling him in. Izuku hit the slick rooftop, sliding towards the dark figure. He reacted instantly, channeling a burst of OFA through his leg. Not an attack, just a focused vibration, an 8% pulse that shattered the ultra-tensile cable into a dozen pieces. He was back on his feet in a second, the green lightning of full cowling now flaring brightly in the smoke. He could see Batman's silhouette now, a darker patch in the gray haze. "Please!" Izuku shouted, holding up his hands. "I not want fight you. You started this fight when you came to my city." Batman snarled, and he was on him. What followed was not a brawl. It was a collision of philosophies expressed through violence. Batman was a storm of brutal precision. His fighting style was a fusion of a dozen martial arts, honed to peak efficiency. Every strike was aimed at a nerve cluster, a joint, a weak point. He flowed around Izuku, testing his defenses, his cape a disorienting shroud. Izuku, in turn, became a bastion of pure defense. He was a whirlwind of green energy, his body moving in ways that seemed to defy physics. His analytical mind was in overdrive, absorbing and processing Batman's movements at an incredible rate. He relies on powerful, disabling strikes. He uses his cape to obscure his footwork. He telegraphs his grapple attempts with a slight shift in his shoulders. Danger sense gave him a split-second head start, but his own analysis and training were what kept him in the fight. He parried a jab aimed at his throat, blocked a kick meant to buckle his knee, and ducked under a sweeping hook that would have knocked him unconscious. He moved with a grace that infuriated Batman, always just out of reach, always turning a lethal blow into a glancing one. The most frustrating part for Batman was that the boy wasn't hitting back. He wasn't throwing a single punch or kick at him. He was only dodging, blocking, and redirecting. It was like fighting a phantom made of light and energy. "Fight back!" Batman roared, pressing his attack. He feinted a punch and swept Batman's legs. Izuku was caught off guard, his feet slipping on the wet surface. He went down, but he twisted in midair, landing on his hands and using a burst of 10% power to spring away, landing gracefully on the ledge of the roof. Batman was relentless. He fired his grappling hook, not at Izuku, but at the chimney behind him. Using it as a pivot point, he swung in an arc, his armored boots aimed directly at Izuku's chest. It was a maneuver designed to slam an opponent off the roof and into the alley 5 stories below. Izuku saw it coming. He had 2 choices: counter with a devastating kick that would likely shatter Batman's legs, or evade. He chose the latter. He leaped backwards, off the roof and into open air. For a heartbeat, Batman thought he had won, that the boy had miscalculated. Then, Izuku kicked off the sheer brick wall of the adjacent building, the impact sending a spiderweb of cracks through the mortar, and launched himself back onto the roof, landing behind Batman. The Dark Knight spun around, his cape flaring. They stood facing each other again, breathing heavily, the rain plastering their costumes to their bodies. The smoke had cleared. The fight had lasted less than a minute, but an eternity of information had been exchanged. Batman was stunned. No one, not Deathstroke, not Ra's al Ghul, had ever evaded him so completely. The boy's speed and agility were superhuman, far beyond street-level metahumans. But it was his restraint that was truly baffling. He'd had a dozen opportunities to land a crippling blow, but he hadn't taken any of them. This wasn't the behavior of a rival kingpin. This was something else. Izuku's chest ached, both from the exertion and the stress of the encounter. He didn't understand. Why was this man attacking him? They were on the same side. Weren't they? Why? Izuku asked, his voice pleading. People, in there, need help. He pointed toward the apartment window where the loan shark was still visible. The Maroni situation is a controlled exercise, Batman said, his voice dangerously calm. My people are moving in now. The real threat was always you. Izuku's eyes widened in horror and betrayal. A trap? He used those people, that family, as bait? The idea was so fundamentally opposed to everything he believed as a hero that it made him physically ill. To endanger civilians, even with a safety net, was an unforgivable line to cross. The last of his deference for this dark, brutal man evaporated, replaced by a righteous, sorrowful anger. That is not hero! Izuku's voice rose, his English breaking down under the emotional strain. A hero never uses people. A hero saves. That is all. That is everything. He took a step forward, no longer just defending, but now admonishing. The green energy around him flared brighter, responding to his emotional state. Batman tensed, reading the shift. This was it. The facade was finally cracking. He moved to intercept, to end this before the boy could unleash his full power. He was faster than any normal human, but he was moving through molasses compared to Deku's new speed. Izuku closed the distance in an instant, but he didn't attack. He grabbed Batman by the thick, armored plates on his shoulders, his grip like steel vices. Batman's mind reeled. The strength was incredible. He felt himself lifted, his feet leaving the ground, and then he was slammed against the brick chimney, the impact rattling his teeth even through the cowl's dampeners. He was pinned, completely immobilized by the boy's raw, overwhelming power. They were inches apart. Batman could see the boy's face clearly now. The freckles standing out against his pale skin. The fierce, determined set of his jaw. And his eyes. They were burning with a furious, passionate light, and they were overflowing with tears that cut clean paths through the grime and rain on his cheeks. Who are you? Batman snarled, struggling against the unbreakable grip, his own fury rising to meet the boy's. What do you want with my city? The possessiveness of the question, the sheer arrogance of it, struck the final chord in Izuku. His tears fell freely now, a mixture of sorrow, anger, and a profound pity for the broken man in front of him. He smiled, that same terrifying, heartbreaking smile that had unnerved a dozen criminals. Your city? He asked, his voice now a powerful, ringing tenor that cut through the sound of the rain. The words came out in a rush of perfect, impassioned English, as if his raw emotion had temporarily bypassed any language barrier. It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to everyone. It belongs to the family you used as bait, and the man who was threatening them. It belongs to all the people who are too scared to walk the streets at night. He leaned closer, his tear-filled eyes boring into the white lenses of Batman's cowl. And what do I want? He continued, his voice cracking with the sheer force of his conviction. I want to save them. All of them. The victims and the villains, the ones who cry for help and the ones who have forgotten how. I want to save everyone. He took a shuddering breath, his grip tightening. Even you. The words struck Batman with more force than any physical blow. Even you. The audacity. The sheer, insane, radical empathy of the statement. It was a direct assault on the very foundation of his existence. He was the protector, the avenger, the immovable object of justice. He was not something to be saved. The notion was so offensive, so fundamentally wrong, that it left him speechless. In that moment, he realized this boy was more dangerous than the Joker. The Joker wanted to prove that everyone was corruptible. This boy was trying to prove that everyone was salvageable. And in Gotham, that was an idea that could burn the whole city to the ground. He renewed his struggle, trying to break the boy's grip, but it was useless. This was a level of strength he couldn't overcome with leverage or technique. Izuku saw the unyielding rage in Batman's posture. He knew this man wouldn't stop. He couldn't bring himself to hurt him, but he had to end this. He had to get away. With a final, sorrowful look, he shoved Batman away. The force sent the Dark Knight stumbling back several feet. Stay back, Izuku warned, his voice low. Batman, of course, did not listen. He charged, a batarang already in his hand. Izuku planted his feet. He had seen this coming. He took a deep breath, pulling more of One for All into his arm than he had dared to use since arriving in this world. The power surged, a raging green river, making his bones ache. Delaware smash! He didn't aim at Batman. He aimed at the air directly in front of him. He flicked his middle finger, a seemingly small gesture that unleashed a cataclysm. 20%. The air itself seemed to shatter. A compressed, focused cannonball of wind erupted from his fingertip. It wasn't a gust. It was a physical wall of force. The sound was a deafening boom that drowned out the city. The shockwave ripped through the rain, blasting it away in a perfect circle. It hit Batman not as a punch, but as an impact from a speeding car. He was lifted off his feet, thrown backwards through the air until his grappling hook snagged automatically on a ledge, saving him from a fatal fall. Every piece of loose gravel, every drop of water, was scoured from the rooftop. The attack lasted less than a second. When it was over, Izuku was panting, his fingers throbbing with a dull, familiar pain. The recoil in this strange dimension was worse, the feedback sharper. He looked across the roof at Batman, who was pulling himself back up, his cape torn, his body bruised, but his will unbroken. There was a new look in the white lenses now, not just anger, but a sliver of something else. And fear. Izuku didn't wait. He turned and leaped into the night, his body a streak of green lightning. He vaulted from rooftop to rooftop, not looking back, the words he had shouted still echoing in his own ears. He had fled, but it didn't feel like a retreat. It felt like a declaration of war. Not on a man, but on an entire way of thinking. Batman stood alone on the rain-swept roof, the wind whistling through the new hole in his cape. He touched his chest, feeling the deep bruises that were already forming. He had fought aliens, gods, and monsters. He had never felt power like that. So absolute yet so controlled. The boy could have turned him into a red smear on the bricks. But he hadn't. He had aimed at the air. He looked down at the street. As he predicted, his undercover officers were calmly escorting a handcuffed Silas Maroney out of the building. The family was safe. The trap had worked. But the real quarry had escaped, and in doing so, had completely redefined the nature of the threat. Alfred's voice crackled in his ear, calm and unwavering. Sir? The asset has been secured. Shall I dispatch the medical team for you? No, Alfred, Bruce rasped, his throat raw. I'm fine, but he wasn't. For the first time in a very long time, he felt a profound sense of uncertainty. He had just confronted the city's newest and most unpredictable variable. It wasn't a criminal seeking power. It wasn't a madman seeking chaos. It was a force of nature, driven by a terrifyingly pure and unwavering ideology. A boy who had looked at the abyss of Gotham, and the bat who stared into it, and had offered to save them both with a tear-streaked smile. As the green light faded into the endless maze of the city, Batman knew his mission had irrevocably changed. He was no longer just hunting a freak. He was facing a fundamental challenge to the soul of his city, and to his own. The confrontation with Batman had been a crucible. It had seared away the last of Izuku Midoriya's naive hope that he could simply be a hero here as he had been at home. The dark vigilante's methods, his willingness to use a terrified family as bait, his possessive claim over the city's soul, had crystallized a new, sharp-edged resolve in Izuku's own heart. He couldn't just fight the symptoms of Gotham's sickness. Punching criminals was a temporary solution, a finger in a dike that was already collapsing. He was treating the fever, not the infection. The infection, he had come to realize in the lonely, echoing hours in his subway tunnel shelter, was despair. It was a palpable entity in this city, a poison in the very air. It was in the slumped shoulders of the people trudging through the rain, in the suspicious, fearful glances they exchanged, in the graffiti that wasn't art but a scream of nihilism. It was the fertile ground from which every mugger, crime lord, and monster grew. Batman fought it with fear, a more powerful poison to counteract the first. He created a world of shadows and consequences, a brutal but stable ecosystem of predator and prey. Izuku knew, with a certainty that resonated in the very core of One for All, that this was the wrong way. You didn't fight darkness by creating a deeper darkness. You fought it by introducing light. Even a single, flickering candle could redefine a whole room. So, his mission changed. He would no longer be a reactive force, a green blur that appeared only when a scream cut through the night. He would become a proactive one. He would stop punching down at the city's broken children and start lifting them up. He would plant seeds of hope in the most barren soil he could find and pray that something, anything, would grow. And there was no soil more barren in all of Gotham than Crime Alley. It was more than a street. It was a scar, a place where the city's dreams had come to die. It was the skeletal remains of a once proud neighborhood, now a labyrinth of condemned tenements, predatory pawn shops, and flickering, sickly neon. It was here that Izuku decided to make his stand, not as a vigilante, but as a builder. His first project was a crumbling stone staircase on the exterior of a tenement that housed 24 families. The bottom 3 steps had collapsed, leaving a treacherous 4-foot gap that residents had to navigate with a series of slick, rotting planks. It was a small thing, an accepted part of the neighborhood's decay, but to Izuku, it was a symbol. It was a daily, physical reminder to every person who lived there that they were forgotten, that their safety was worthless. He arrived before dawn, a ghost in the pre-light gloom. He found the original stone slabs in a pile of rubble behind the building, each one weighing close to 300 pounds. For him, they were heavy, but manageable. He began to work, the only sounds the scrape of stone on stone and his own steady breathing. He used his strength not for destruction, but for creation. He cleared the debris, leveled the ground, and with the immense power of One for All flowing through his limbs at a controlled 2%, he began to lift the massive slabs back into place. He worked with the meticulous care of a sculptor, ensuring each stone was perfectly level and secure. He used a mixture of scavenged cement powder and water to seal the gaps, his gloved fingers acting as a trowel. It was hard, grueling work, a different kind of burn than the one he felt from training or combat. As the sun began its weak, watery ascent, the residents began to stir. A window screeched open above him. A tired-looking woman with dark circles under her eyes peered down, her expression a mixture of fear and confusion. She saw him, the grin, the smiling ghost from the rumors, doing manual labor. She quickly shut the window. Soon, others appeared. They watched from doorways and windows, silent and suspicious. They were like a colony of frightened animals, unsure if the strange new creature in their midst was a predator or something else entirely. They saw the impossible strength, the casual way he lifted stones that would take 4 men to budge. They saw the torn, bizarre costume, but they also saw the intense focus, the lack of malice, the sheer, unambiguous constructiveness of his actions. He wasn't breaking things. He was fixing them. An old woman, her back bent like a question mark, shuffled out onto the street. Her name was Martha, and she had lived in this building for 60 years. She had seen it go from a respectable working-class home to this ruin. She clutched a thin shawl around her shoulders and watched the boy work. He was humming softly to himself, a tune she didn't recognize, a cheerful, upbeat melody that was utterly alien to the alley's usual soundtrack of sirens and shouting. When he finally set the last stone in place, he stood back to admire his work. The staircase was whole again. It was solid. It was safe. He turned, and for the first time, noticed his audience. 24 pairs of eyes were fixed on him. His instincts, forged in a world where heroism was celebrated, made him want to give a thumbs up and a bright smile. But he had learned. Here, that was frightening, so he just nodded. A small, simple gesture of acknowledgement. He turned to leave, his job done. Wait! The voice was thin and reedy, but it cut through the silence. It was Martha. She had shuffled forward, her expression unreadable. She held out a small, lumpy object wrapped in a napkin. It was half a stale bread roll. For the work, she said, her voice raspy. She wouldn't meet his eyes, instead staring at the new steps. They've been broken for years. Years. Izuku froze. He looked at the meager offering in her trembling hand. It was probably her breakfast. It was given not out of affection, but out of a deeply ingrained sense of transaction, the only way she knew how to deal with a powerful entity. You paid your dues, whether to a mob boss or a monster, so it would leave you alone or maybe even protect you, but to Izuku, it was more precious than gold. It was the first seed. He reached out and gently took the bread, his gloved fingers brushing against hers. He gave her a small, genuine smile, this one without the tears, without the manic defiance. It was just a quiet, grateful smile. Arigato, he whispered, the Japanese word soft and out of place. Thank you? He took a bite of the stale bread, and it was the best thing he had tasted in months. As he walked away, he heard something he hadn't heard in this alley before. The sound of two neighbors, who had previously lived in fearful silence, starting to talk to each other, their voices filled with a bewildered wonder as they stared at their new staircase. That single act became a catalyst. Izuku's campaign of radical hope began in earnest. He became Crime Alley's resident handyman, its guardian angel, its strange, green janitor. He used the 15% Detroit smash, channeled underground, to clear a sewer line that had been backing up for a decade, flooding basements with filth. He used his speed to patch a dozen leaky roofs in a single night. He found a broken water main the city had ignored for years and, using his immense strength, crimped the massive pipe shut before rerouting the connection, restoring clean water to a block that had been living on bottled handouts. He also protected the people. When a slumlord's thugs came to illegally evict a family, they didn't find a terrified single mother. They found a grin, sitting on the front stoop, patiently waiting for them. He didn't break their bones. He dismantled their car, piece by piece, laying the engine block, tires, and doors out on the pavement in a neat, orderly display. He left them with their crowbars and their eviction notice, and the impossible task of reassembling their vehicle. They never came back. The people's perception of him began to change. The fear was still there, a low-level hum of uncertainty, but it was being overlaid with something else. Gratitude. Dependence. A fragile, budding trust. The children were the first to fully accept him. They would see his green lightning in the distance, and instead of hiding, they would wave. They started calling him Midori, the Japanese word for green, a name one of the older kids had looked up at the public library. He cleared a lot filled with rusted-out cars and hazardous waste, turning it into a makeshift playground. He sat on a rooftop and watched them play, the sound of their laughter a balm on his own aching loneliness. This, he thought, was what being a hero was really about. Not the glory, not the fight, but the laughter of children who felt safe enough to play. In his brightly lit, chronically overwhelmed office at GCPD headquarters, Commissioner James Gordon rubbed his temples, trying to stave off a migraine. On his desk were 2 preliminary crime reports for the week. They were for the same city, but they might as well have been from 2 different planets. The first was from the 12th precinct, covering the Diamond District and the Financial District. It was business as usual. 3 armed robberies, a high-stakes jewel heist foiled by Batman, and a litany of white-collar crimes. The report mentioned their new vigilante problem in a scathing addendum from the precinct captain. The entity known as the Grin continues to be a menace to standard police procedure. Gordon read aloud, his voice dripping with tired sarcasm. At 2,300 hours, subject interfered with the arrest of a known Falcone enforcer, one Mickey the Shiv Gallo. Subject physically disarmed Officer Davies and proceeded to engage the suspect in what Officer Davies described as a tearful heart-to-heart. Subject then allowed Gallo to flee the scene before vanishing. This office formally requests that this anarchist be classified as a high-priority threat to law and order. Gordon sighed and tossed the report onto a pile. Anarchist. Menace. He could see their point. From a cop's perspective, the guy was a nightmare, ignoring laws, procedures, and the entire justice system in favor of his own bizarre brand of street therapy. Then he picked up the second report. It was from the 5th Precinct. Crime Alley. Historically, the 5th was a cesspool, a place where rookies were sent to be hazed and old-timers were sent to coast into retirement. Its reports were usually a litany of human misery, assaults, overdoses, domestic disputes, murders. This week's report was different. Gordon had to read the summary twice to make sure it wasn't a typo. Violent crime, homicide, assault W/deadly weapon 0, down from 8 weekly average. Petty crime, mugging B, pickpocketing 3, down from 47 weekly average. Domestic disturbance calls, 1, down from 32 weekly average. It was impossible. A statistical anomaly so profound it bordered on the miraculous. He flipped to the attached field notes from the beat cop assigned to the area, a grizzled veteran named Sergeant Miller. Miller's report was a masterpiece of bewildered professionalism. Have patrolled the assigned sector in Crime Alley for 7 consecutive nights. The atmosphere is changed. Residents, who are normally hostile or silent, are now making eye contact. Have observed multiple instances of community gatherings in the evenings. Laughter was noted. Laughter. From children. The area is also significantly cleaner. Reports of repaired plumbing, electricity, and structural integrity in several buildings, all performed by unknown parties. We have received 0 official complaints about the vigilante the Grin. Unofficially, residents refer to him as a guardian or some kind of spirit. While his methods elsewhere are unorthodox and disruptive, the tangible results in this sector are undeniable and, frankly, unnerving. Recommend holding a community outreach meeting to ascertain the situation, though I suspect we will be met with a wall of silence. The people here are protecting him. Gordon put the report down and stared out his window at the perpetually gray Gotham skyline. What was he supposed to do with this? The Bat was convinced the Grin was a threat, a manipulator building a private army. Half his force saw him as an enemy combatant. But Sergeant Miller's report painted a different picture. It painted a picture of a broken neighborhood slowly, impossibly, starting to heal itself under the influence of this strange new force. The seeds of hope. The seeds of chaos. Gordon was standing right where they were being sown, and he had no idea if he was looking at a garden or a time bomb. In the clock tower, a secret spire of light and data hidden in the heart of Gotham, Barbara Gordon watched the chaos unfold on a purely digital level. For her, the Grin wasn't a ghost or a spirit. He was a rogue algorithm, a piece of code that was systematically breaking every predictive model she had. It doesn't make sense, she muttered, her fingers flying across her keyboard, pulling up dozens of data streams. Heat maps, crime statistics, social media chatter, dark web whispers. All of it pointed to the same impossible conclusion. Her systems were built on the assumption of rational, albeit often insane, actors. She could predict the Joker's next target by looking for symbols of order he would want to corrupt. She could predict Riddler's crimes by solving his preliminary ciphers. She could predict Penguin's moves by analyzing the criminal stock market. All of them were motivated by something understandable: nihilism, ego, greed. The Grin was motivated by help. His operational algorithm is help, she explained, her voice tight, when Bruce's icon blinked to life on her main screen for their nightly check-in. His voice, distorted and low, filled the room. Report Oracle. He's consolidated his activities in Crime Alley, Bruce. And I don't mean consolidated like a gang. He's acting like a one-man public works department. I've correlated municipal maintenance requests with eyewitness accounts of his activity. He's fixed the sewer main on Caro Street, patched the roof of the old clinic, and rewired the power grid for 3 city blocks. The city should be paying him. He's creating a dependency. Bruce's voice growled back. He's making them reliant on his power. When he leaves, or when he's taken down, that entire section of the city will collapse into a state worse than it was before. He's giving them a drug, not a cure. I know the theory, Bruce, but the data is compelling, Barbara countered, pulling up Miller's field report. Look at these numbers. This isn't a drug, this is a miracle. He's not just stopping crime, he's erasing the reasons for it. People aren't as desperate. There's a sense of, well, the data suggests a quantifiable increase in community morale. Morale doesn't stop a bullet from Falcone when he decides to reclaim his territory. The Grin is building a house of cards on the most dangerous piece of real estate in the world. It's unstable. What's his threat index? Barbara sighed, pulling up another screen. It was a complex web of data points, showing the subject's power levels, psychological profile, and predictability. The last one was blinking a furious, angry red. That's the problem, she said. His predictability score is 0. He operates without a discernible pattern of escalation or personal gain. Last night, satellite thermal imaging picked him up. You know what he was doing at 3 a.m.? Making his move on the East End docks? No. He spent 2 hours rescuing a colony of stray cats from a flooded basement. And then he apparently spent another hour herding them towards the Gotham animal shelter. She paused, letting the sheer absurdity of it sink in. He will expend the same amount of energy and treat with the same level of urgency a multi-million-dollar arms deal and a litter of kittens. He is a purely chaotic variable. We can't predict his next move because anything could be his next move. If he sees a problem, he fixes it. That makes him the most dangerous player in Gotham. He's not playing the game. He's knocking over the whole board. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Bruce was processing, his formidable mind trying to fit this new, impossible piece into the dark puzzle of his city. He is a seed of a different kind of chaos, Bruce finally said, his voice grim. And I will not let him take root. Keep tracking him. I want to know everything. Who he helps, what he eats, where he sleeps. Sooner or later, he will make a mistake. The connection cut out, leaving Barbara alone with the glowing screens. She looked at the blinking red 0 of his predictability score. Bruce saw a threat to be neutralized. Gordon saw a confusing paradox. The people of Crime Alley saw a savior. Barbara, the woman who dealt in pure information, saw something else. She saw a singularity, an event beyond which the future of Gotham could no longer be predicted, and it terrified her. On a rooftop overlooking the small, vibrant pocket he had carved out of Gotham's decay, Izuku Midoriya ate the other half of the stale bread roll Martha had given him. He was rationing it, making it last. It tasted like victory. Below him, his little candle in the darkness was burning brightly. The playground he had cleared was full of children, their laughter echoing off the brick walls. 2 men who, a month ago, would have tried to mug each other were now working together to board up a broken window. A small market had sprung up, with residents bartering what little they had. It wasn't perfect. It was still Crime Alley. But it was alive. He was so tired his bones felt like they were made of lead. He was perpetually hungry. The ache of loneliness was a constant, dull pain in his chest. He missed his friends with a ferocity that sometimes stole his breath. But as he looked down at the scene below, a genuine smile touched his lips. It was small, and it was tired, but it was real. He wasn't just fighting villains anymore. He wasn't just reacting to the city's pain. He was building something. It was fragile. He knew Batman was right in that regard. It was a house of cards. A single gust of wind from the city's true powers, the Falcones, the Maronis, the Joker, could blow it all down. But as he watched a little girl share her apple with a boy who had none, he realized it didn't matter. You don't refuse to plant a garden just because you're afraid of a storm. You plant it, you nurture it, and you protect it with everything you have. He was a hero. And his garden was finally starting to grow. He pulled the tattered blanket tighter around his shoulders, his eyes never leaving the small spark of life below. He would be its gardener. He would be its guardian. He would be its grin. And he would let no one, not the criminals and not the bat, snuff it out. In a laboratory hidden beneath a defunct, rat-infested Gotham granary, Dr. Jonathan Crane was observing a work of art. It was not a painting or a sculpture, but a series of waveforms dancing across a high-resolution monitor. They represented the collective terror of a city, the raw EG data of Gotham's fear, translated into a symphony of panic spikes and deep, throbbing troughs of anxiety. To Crane, it was the most beautiful music in the world. It was the sound of truth. For years, his work had been a validation of his central, unwavering thesis: fear is the prime mover of the human animal. All other emotions, love, hope, courage, were mere affectations, fragile veneers painted over the screaming, primal terror that resided at the core of every soul. He had proven it time and again. He had reduced Gotham's most powerful mobsters to whimpering children, its bravest cops to paranoid wrecks. Even the Batman, that self-appointed symbol of order, was a creature born of, and defined by, fear. But recently, a discordant note had appeared in his symphony. A single, stubborn signal that refused to harmonize with the chorus of dread. It originated from the city's most hopeless quarter, Crime Alley, and it pulsed with a strange, illogical frequency. The signal's name, according to the whispers of the underworld, was the Grin. Crane, a man of academia before he was a monster of fear, had studied this anomaly with scientific detachment. He had compiled the reports, the impossible strength, the chaotic kindness, the unnerving, tear-filled smile. He watched from afar as the new variable began to systematically alter the chemical balance of his favorite test site. He saw violent crime plummet. He saw a community, a concept he considered a foolish fantasy, beginning to form in the petri dish of Gotham's worst decay. This was not merely an annoyance. It was a professional and philosophical insult. This Grin was peddling a poison more insidious than any of Joker's laughing gas. He was selling hope, and hope, to Dr. Crane, was the most dangerous delusion of all. It was a lie that made the eventual, inevitable descent into fear all the more agonizing. It was a cancer on the purity of his research. He would not allow it. He would perform an experiment. He would isolate this anomaly and prove that it, too, would break under the correct psychological pressure. Like any good scientist, he would introduce a catalyst to the system and observe the results. His catalyst was a masterpiece. It was his magnum opus, a new strain of his signature toxin synthesized over the last 6 months. He called it despair. His previous formulas were crude instruments by comparison, inducing primal, visual fears, spiders, snakes, monstrous versions of loved ones. Despair was far more elegant. It was a neurochemical scalpel designed to bypass the superficial horrors of the amygdala and attack the soul directly. It didn't make you see monsters. It made you feel the absolute, crushing certainty that your life had no meaning, that your struggles were pointless, that everyone you loved secretly despised you, and that your greatest failures were the only true things about you. It didn't induce the fear of death. It induced the fear of having ever lived at all. Crime Alley would be his stage. The nascent community of hope would be his audience. And the Grin, the smiling symbol of this foolish uprising, would be his star subject. Crane would show him the truth. He would show him the exquisite, liberating agony of pure, undiluted fear. He would wipe that ridiculous smile off his face and replace it with a scream that would finally harmonize with the rest of his symphony. The evening had settled over Crime Alley with a strange, uncharacteristic peace. The usual sounds of sirens and shouting were replaced by a low hum of activity. The new playground Izuku had cleared was filled with the fading laughter of children being called home for dinner. Martha, the old woman who had given him the bread, was sweeping her stoop, even nodding a quiet good evening to her neighbor. A fragile ecosystem of trust was taking root. Izuku watched from his favorite gargoyle perched 3 blocks away, a small, weary smile on his face. This was his proof. This was the evidence that his struggle, his loneliness, his sacrifice was worth it. He had created a small, safe pocket in a city of nightmares. He didn't notice the fog. It wasn't a natural mist rolling in from the river. It was thin, almost invisible, and it carried a faint, sweetish scent, like rotting hay and old paper. It seeped from newly installed grates on the corners of the street, aerosolizers Crane's men had disguised as city maintenance equipment over the past week. It crept silently along the pavement, curling into doorways and under windows, a ghostly, invading army. The change was subtle at first. A woman calling her son in for dinner suddenly saw not a child, but a leering, malicious goblin wearing her son's face, and she slammed the door, her heart seizing with inexplicable terror. Two men sharing a cigarette on a stoop suddenly saw each other's friendly smiles as predatory, deceitful masks, and they backed away from each other, hands reaching for imagined weapons. Then, the symphony began. A single scream, high and sharp. Then another. Then a chorus. The fragile piece of Crime Alley shattered like a dropped pane of glass. The laughter was replaced by shrieks of terror. The low murmur of conversation was replaced by accusations and sobs. Izuku was on his feet in an instant, his heart lurching. The sounds were wrong. This wasn't the sound of a mugging or a gang fight. This was the sound of mass hysteria. It was the sound of 100 minds breaking at once. He leaped, full cowling flaring to life at 10%. He crossed the 3 blocks in a series of silent, soaring bounds, landing in the middle of the street he had worked so hard to heal. The scene before him was a Bosch painting brought to life. The people he had sworn to protect were lost in their own private hells. A man was on his knees, clawing at the pavement, screaming about the bugs crawling under his skin. A mother was huddled in a corner, shielding her baby from a husband who was staring at his own hands in horror, seeing them as rusted, bloody blades. Martha was swinging her broom wildly at phantoms only she could see, her face a mask of terror. The community he had built had dissolved into a panicked mob of isolated, terrified individuals. They were turning on each other, lashing out at the monsters of their own creation. "Stop!" Izuku yelled, his voice desperate. "Please, what's wrong?" "It's okay. I'm here to help." He reached out to help the man clawing at the ground, but the man recoiled, screaming, "Don't touch me. Your hands are snakes." It was then that Izuku smelled it. The sickly sweet odor. He saw the faint, yellow-green haze hanging in the air. A gas attack. A villain. His mind instantly shifted from confusion to crisis mode. He needed to get these people out. He needed to find the source. He took a deep breath to shout instructions, and that was his mistake. The despair toxin flooded his lungs. It was tasteless, but he felt it instantly, a cold, tingling sensation that spread through his veins like ice water. The world didn't just blur, it sharpened with a terrifying, malevolent clarity. The edges of the buildings seemed to keen and whine. The colors of the neon signs bled like open wounds. And then, the visions began. It started with a sound he hadn't heard in what felt like a lifetime, his mother's voice. But it wasn't the warm, encouraging voice from his memories. It was thin, spectral, and full of a terrible, weeping disappointment. He spun around and saw her standing there, in the middle of the chaos of Crime Alley, her face pale and streaked with tears. But her eyes were wrong. They were hollow, accusing. "Izuku, why did you leave me?" The phantom whispered, her voice echoing in his skull. "Was my love not enough? You abandoned me for this filth. For these broken people who don't even want you. You chose them over me. You broke my heart, my son." The words were a physical blow, striking at the deepest core of his guilt. He stumbled back, shaking his head. "No. Mom, no, I had to. I'm a hero." "A hero?" The new voice belonged to Ida. He was there, standing beside Izuku's mother, but his legs were twisted and mangled, his ingenium armor shattered. Uraraka floated beside him, her face slack, her eyes empty voids. Todoroki stood with his back to him, the eyes on his right side cracked and weeping, the flames on his left extinguished. "You call this heroism, Midoriya?" Ida's voice was cold, stripped of all its usual passion. "Look at us. We fought. We fell. And where were you? You ran. You left us to fight your battles while you played savior in this gutter. We needed you, Deku," Uraraka's voice whispered, a dead, hollow sound. "And you weren't there. You're not a symbol of hope. You're a monument to your own selfishness." "No! That's not true!" Izuku cried out, clutching his head. The people of Crime Alley, in their own toxin-fueled nightmares, saw the green monster they revered clutching its head and screaming at invisible phantoms. To them, he was just another monster in the madness. But the toxin was not done. It had saved its most potent venom for last. A familiar, hacking cough cut through the other voices. Izuku looked up and saw him. All Might. Not the shining, muscular symbol of peace, but the skeletal, broken form of Tashinori Yagi. He was leaning against the wall, coughing blood into a handkerchief, the embers of one for all dying in his sunken eyes. He looked at Izuku not with anger, but with a soul-shattering, profound disappointment. "I made a mistake, my boy," Toshinori rasped, his voice weak and full of regret. "I saw a fire in you. I thought you had the heart of a true hero. But I was wrong. The power, it was too much for you. It's a sacred torch, passed down through generations, and you just dropped it. You let the flame go out. You have failed me. You have failed them all." The Phantom All Might gestured a bony hand at the images of his weeping mother, his broken friends. "This is your legacy, ninth. Failure. You are not a hero. You are just a broken boy, a world away from home, who was never, ever good enough." This was it. The final, perfect dose of despair. The toxin had presented him with his deepest fears, not as monsters to be fought, but as established, unchangeable facts. His quest was pointless. His power was a burden he had failed to carry. His heroism was a selfish delusion. The logical, intended result was surrender. A complete psychological collapse. The subject should now curl into a ball and weep until his mind frayed into nothing. But Izuku Midoriya's mind was not built like other minds. His relationship with his fears, his failures, his regrets, was unique. For years, they had been the stones he carried in his pockets. But over time, through sheer, stubborn force of will, he had learned to use them not as weight, but as fuel. He was on his knees, tears streaming down his face, the phantoms of his failures looming over him. He was broken. He was terrified. He was in more pain than he had ever known, and in that moment of absolute despair, something inside him, the unquenchable fire that All Might had seen all those years ago, roared to life. He looked up at the specter of his master, at the ghosts of his friends, at the sorrowful image of his mother. And his tears, which had been tears of pain, now became tears of rage, a pure, righteous, heroic rage. "No!" he screamed, his voice raw, tearing through the phantom world the toxin had built. "You're wrong!" He staggered to his feet, his body trembling with a new, terrifying power. The green lightning of One for All flared around him, brighter and more violent than ever before. He pointed a shaking finger at the phantom of his mother. "I miss you every second of every day. But I'm doing this so that no other mother has to feel the fear that you felt. So they can be safe." He turned to his friends. "I failed you by not being there? No. I honor your sacrifice by fighting here. I carry all of you with me. Your courage, your strength, your friendship, it's what makes me a hero." Finally, he faced All Might. He looked at the image of his broken mentor, the symbol of his greatest fear, and he smiled. It was a terrifying, beautiful, manic sight, a smile that was a declaration of war against despair itself. "You chose wrong, All Might?" Izuku's voice was now a triumphant roar. "You never chose wrong. You chose someone who would never give up. You passed your power to someone who will carry the weight of all his failures and use them to get even stronger. I will not let your legacy die. I will not let this power fade. It's because I'm scared of failing you that I will never, ever lose." The toxin, in its attempt to show him his fears, had made a fatal miscalculation. It had held a mirror up to his soul, expecting to find a coward. Instead, it had shown him the very source of his indomitable will. It had reminded him of why he fought. The hallucinations of his loved ones, meant to be his tormentors, now transformed. His mother's face softened, her accusatory glare replaced with her familiar, loving smile. His friends were no longer broken, but stood tall in their hero costumes, giving him determined nods of support. And All Might, the skeletal form was gone, replaced by the towering, magnificent figure of the symbol of peace in his prime, his fists raised, his signature, booming laughter echoing in Izuku's mind. "That's the spirit, my boy!" The true All Might's voice boomed, drowning out the whispers of the toxin. "A hero can always break out of a tough spot. Now show this villain what it means to go beyond. Plus ultra!" The phantom world shattered. Izuku was back in Crime Alley, on his knees, surrounded by screaming civilians. But he was no longer a victim of the fear. He was a conduit for a power far greater. The toxin hadn't broken him. It had supercharged him. He rose to his feet, a living tempest of green energy. His tears still flowed freely, but his smile was blindingly bright. To the terrified onlookers, he was the most horrific monster of all, a laughing, weeping god of lightning who had finally gone mad. Dr. Crane watched from a rooftop half a block away through a pair of high-powered binoculars, his jaw slack. "Impossible," he whispered, his scientific composure cracking for the first time in his life. The subject is metabolizing the toxin. He's weaponizing his own trauma. This is not a valid psychological response." Izuku looked at the chaos, at the yellow-green haze still clinging to the ground. He knew what he had to do. He had to cleanse the air. He had to perform surgery on the atmosphere. He planted his feet, digging his armored soles into the asphalt. He took a deep, shuddering breath, pulling on a reserve of one for all that terrified even him. Power surged through his veins, a raging green inferno that made every cell in his body scream. The lightning around him turned from emerald to a blinding, almost white-hot green. The air crackled with ozone, 45%. He threw his right arm back, his muscles coiling like a mythological serpent. "This ends now," he roared to the heavens. "St. Louis." Smash! He didn't punch forward. He punched upward. He unleashed the full, cataclysmic force of the blow into the sky above Crime Alley. The result was not an explosion. It was an implosion. For a single, silent moment, the air where he had punched seemed to vanish, creating a vacuum. Then, reality rushed back in with a deafening, thunderous roar. A massive, controlled vortex of wind erupted from his fist, a miniature tornado that shot straight into the perpetual cloud cover of Gotham. It sucked the heavier-than-air despair toxin off the streets, pulling it from the alleyways and from the very lungs of the people. Dust, trash, loose papers, and the yellow-green fog were all drawn into the swirling column of wind. It was a pillar of cleansing fury, carrying the poison high into the upper atmosphere where it would disperse into harmless trace elements. When the vortex dissipated, the air in Crime Alley was clean. The sickly sweet smell was gone. The people, their minds suddenly clear, collapsed, their bodies exhausted, their memories a confused nightmare of monsters and paranoia. The silence that followed was profound. Izuku stood in the center of it all, his arms smoking, the bones screaming in protest from the strain. He was panting, drained, but his eyes were clear and full of a burning purpose. His danger sense, which had been a dull roar during the chaos, was now a single, sharp spike, pointing him towards a nearby rooftop. He was there in 2 leaps. Jonathan Crane didn't even have time to run. One moment he was staring in disbelief at the aftermath of his failed experiment. The next, a green blur slammed into him. His gas dispersal gear was shattered, his precious syringe of pure toxin knocked from his hand. He found himself pinned against a brick wall, a hand of terrifying strength clamped around his throat, lifting him off the ground. He looked into the face of his subject. The boy's eyes were red-rimmed and puffy from crying, but they held no hatred. No malice. Only a deep, bottomless well of sorrowful understanding. Crane tried to activate his final defense, a small nozzle in the finger of his glove containing a concentrated dose. But the boy's grip was like iron. Crane, the master of fear, felt a new and entirely unwelcome sensation. The cold, sharp, personal terror of complete and utter powerlessness. "You hurt them," Izuku's voice was a low, shaking whisper. "You used their pain to make them afraid." He leaned closer, his own tears starting to well up again, not from the toxin, but from pure, raw empathy. "Why? Fear is the only truth," Crane rasped, struggling for breath. Izuku looked deep into the man's eyes, past the burlap mask, past the arrogant scientist. And he saw it. The same thing he saw in the desperate muggers and broken thugs. The same thing he saw in Batman's obsessive rage. He saw a small, frightened soul, hiding from the world behind a wall of its own making. His grip loosened slightly. His expression softened. "You're just scared, aren't you?" Izuku whispered, the words striking Crane with more force than any punch. "It must be so lonely, being this afraid all the time, hiding behind that mask, trying to make everyone else feel as scared as you do." Crane's mind, which had withstood the Joker's madness and Batman's fury, simply stopped working. The statement was so absurd, so alien to his entire paradigm, that it bypassed all his defenses. "It's okay," Izuku continued, his voice cracking with a sincerity that was more terrifying than any threat. "I can help you." He didn't say he would punish him. He didn't say he would stop him. He said he would help him. That was the blow that finally broke Dr. Jonathan Crane. The sheer, weaponized empathy of it all. To have his life's work, his entire identity as a master of fear, dismissed as a symptom of his own cowardice, and then to be offered salvation by his intended victim, was a psychological attack so profound it shattered his psyche. A tremor started in his hands. His breath hitched. A low, keening sound escaped his lips. He began to shiver, not from the cold, but from a complete and total system overload. Izuku, seeing the man was no longer a threat, gently lowered him to the ground. He left him there, a huddled, shivering wreck curled up against the wall, not broken by fear, but by a kindness so radical it had the same effect. As the distant sound of the Batmobile's approaching engine filled the air, Izuku Midoriya faded back into the shadows, leaving the Master of Fear to be collected by the city's dark night, a man who would never understand that his greatest foe had just been defeated not by a fist, but by a whisper of compassion.